which we have not done as yet. Congressman Erik Paulsen really needs no introduction. In January of 2015, he was sworn in to serve his 4th term representing Minnesota's 3rd Congressional District. His legislative agenda parallels the initiatives that make Minnesota a great place to live, work, and raise a family. A strong economic climate for job growth, a fairly funded and accountable economic education system, a well-preserved environment, safe communities, and tax reform for taxpayers and businesses. Erik brings real-life experience to Capitol Hill with over 16 years of business experience, including working as a business analyst at Target Corporation. Before being elected to Congress in 2008, Paulsen represented Minnesota for 14 years in the State Legislature, where he served as House Majority Leader from 2003 to 2007. He received his BA in mathematics from St. Olaf College and resides in Eden Prairie with his wife and their 4 children. So welcome here.
Thank you and good afternoon. And I have to say it's really impressive just knowing all the great things that the Rotarians here in Bloomington are a part of it, are helping in our community, and Mary, just thanks for your leadership and also inviting the day makers to be with you. Oh, you're gonna hook me up? Seems I can't roll around. No. Are you okay? No, that's right. But I have to say this, is that, Bloomington's a special place, and it's probably because you're just so well represented by some great public servants. I have a chance to interact with the mayor, the council members, at a lot of different events all around the city periodically. Excuse me, you got Normandale College. Joyce is here, obviously, but Normandale is a great institution here locally. I've had a chance to visit many classrooms in Bloomington, and Superintendent Fujitaki knows that. And of course, Chief Potts coming up in the ranks and being here with a long history in public service as well, serving our community. And such great things as Rotarians, whether it's the STRIVE program or your other missions, working with other charitable organizations. It's just, it's proud to represent folks like you because you get it and you are getting stuff done. And I thought that would be kind of the theme I would just hit upon. And I hit 2 themes actually. One is just getting stuff done in Washington, and 2 is part of that is trying to create a healthier economy. And first, if you can get over the fact that I work in a city, Washington is notorious for not getting things done. It can be a very challenging environment, but I think it's worth sharing a few, just a few elements or statistics that, to be honest, a lot of folks aren't aware of. And it's kind of interesting because, with 24-hour news cycle and the way the media is today, you don't learn about some of the accomplishments and some of the good things that are happening. And there's a couple of things I want to point out right away. One, I would definitely make the contention, as someone who majored in math at St. Olaf, make the point that there's no doubt that in the last 7 months, this Congress has actually been more accountable, more open, and more productive than in the 30-year history we've had. And you wouldn't really know that unless you really dug into the details, and details do actually matter. Just in terms of accountability, it's interesting because more bills have actually passed out of committee, where you have sort of thoughtful input, you hear the testimony, rather than just leadership bringing a bill to the floor and kind of pushing it through, right? And then you don't have as much discussion and you deal with the repercussions afterwards, no matter what the size of the bill was, et cetera. So we're actually 3 percentage points ahead of the 30-year average, in terms of where bills are actually getting more description or discussion in committee and moving forward. So it's more accountable in that standpoint. It's more open because in a 25-year average, there's a lot more open discussion, a lot more amendments that get offered. We're like 200 amendments above the 25-year average of where Democrats and Republicans, doesn't matter your party, you can offer your idea, you can debate it on the floor, it doesn't always pass, but that openness is really, really important, and members appreciate that greatly. And it's actually been more productive on a 30-year average. We've actually passed more bills. And actually, the Senate's actually, the House and Senate have passed more bills than the 30-year average. Now, what are you passing, right? I mean, in terms of what are you signing into law, what's the president signing into law? But we are ahead of the 30-year average. And there's some really important initiatives that have actually passed. And, a couple of them right off the bat. And this is really, really key. One is just dealing with veterans. The Clay Hunt bill, which was a bill that deals with mental illness and making sure that when veterans are returning, from overseas or over from deployment, that they're actually getting some certain services. And that's important when you think about 20-some veterans here committing suicide in the United States, which is an epidemic. And it's actually the first bill signing that I've actually ever been invited to the White House to participate in. And so Congressman Walz from southern Minnesota was a key player in that legislation as well. And so some of us that had a hand in drafting that or promoting it and pushing it forward were a part of a bipartisan signing ceremony. And it's just good to see that move forward on behalf of veterans. And actually, I have to credit Chief Potts as well, because this issue of human trafficking, which is a big issue. And I was eye-opened right away when I had a chance to do a ride-along with some in the Bloomington Police Department. And you wouldn't think that human trafficking or sex trafficking is something that's happening here in the United States. And the reality is it is. And it might be because Bloomington has a large hospitality industry, right? And so there's some opportunity for that kind of activity to take place, or because of our transportation infrastructure. But Minneapolis is number 13 in the country for this type of human trafficking or sex trafficking. And you wouldn't even realize that. This is not something happening in some faraway country. It's actually happening right in our backyards. And the good news is we've actually done some really important things to combat it, to stop it, and effectively push back in a different direction. And that's been very bipartisan in terms of seeing some of that support. In fact, one of the provisions that Senator Klobuchar and I worked on together, giving safe harbor to young juveniles, we're talking about 12, 13, 14-year-old girls, right, that get caught up in this, making sure they get safe harbor. They're not going to get prosecuted for prostitution or drugs or alcohol. Instead, they're going to get services, they're going to get treatment, they're going to be brought out of the shadows, they're going to be encouraged to turn in the bad guys. And one of the provisions that was actually in my bill that got signed into law just this last month was credited, allowing local law enforcement to work with the U.S. Marshals to track down some of these guys. And so a teenager went missing in Tennessee just a month ago, and she was found in Virginia because the U.S. Marshals Service gotten involved, and they had the resources working with local law enforcement. And so they were able to rescue the girl, capture the bad guy, and they credit that provision with actually saving a life in essence. And so it's good to know that some really good things are happening in there, but there's a lot more obviously to be done. And I'll mention this too, the Steve Gleason Act. He used to be he was a professional football player from New Orleans, and he's credited for some superstar athletic moments. But someone like him who gets ALS, and we all know about ALS because of the Ice Bucket Challenge, right, from last summer, and the money that was raised for that institute or for that nonprofit and bringing more awareness forward. But now you have a government agency, ironically at the same time, in Medicare, that was actually proposing not to let anyone with ALS or a similar speech degenerating disease or debilitation from getting access to certain medical technologies that allow these patients to actually communicate with their loved ones, to communicate with their family or even their physicians. And so Medicare was holding that back. And so big bipartisan vote. I was one of the chief co-authors of the bill, or 4 of us, and we moved that through very bipartisanly, and now we'll protect that medical innovation. And in Minnesota, we're more used to this medical innovation because we have such a high propensity of jobs in the medical technology industry, of course, but a lot of other communities around the country weren't. And so we were able to jump on that and actually pass it. And I have to mention 2 other things, then I'll just talk a little bit about the healthier economy component. But one, and this is something I think that a lot of folks aren't aware of unless you're a senior or unless you're a doctor. And every year, Washington's been a part of this annual accounting gimmick, one of our biggest accounting gimmicks actually, and it's been called the Doc Fix. It's a formula that was put in place in 1997. And every year or so, Congress has always backfilled this 20% cut that would come to any physician that would see a senior, right? So what happened was, essentially over the years, a lot of physicians were kind of throwing up their hands saying, I don't know if we're going to get cut 20% this year. Maybe we're going to stop seeing seniors. And so a lot of doctors were seeing fewer seniors over time. Gave seniors a lot of uncertainty because they were being pulled back from seeing some of their regular physicians that they want to have the doctor-patient relationship with, right? And the good news is, and it happened right at Easter. I mean, I'll never forget the phone call I got from the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, my new chairman, Paul Ryan, because this is in our jurisdiction. And he said, listen, within a week, we're going to have something cooking on this moving forward. And it's really important that, we pay attention. This is in our jurisdiction. And literally you had kind of the far left and the far right get pushed aside, and we passed a permanent solution fixing this problem. So we will never, ever have to deal with this problem again, and it's been permanently solved. And the best news of it, just from a pure taxpayer standpoint, it literally will save like $2.9 trillion over the next couple decades, because it's the first entitlement reform in Medicare that's been addressed in like 2 decades, right? And so that's important, just knowing we got 10,000 baby boomers retiring each and every day. It's going to have important ramifications down the road. And then finally, I should mention an area of bipartisan, a big win. I'll credit, a lot of Democrats don't like to talk about it, but I will, because Republicans in Congress were working with the president pretty closely in terms of passing new trade opportunities for new agreements. And so whether it's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where you have emerging markets, it's where the center of economic activity is going to be for years to come, or in Europe, where you've got some of our traditional allies and friends, we've got opportunity to enhance trade there. It's the European Trade Agreement. We have these 2 trade agreements that are kind of off and running right now, because we passed trade promotion authority with the president, giving him the opportunity to negotiate these agreements. He's still got to come to Congress to get the up and down vote, but it guarantees that Congress gets to highlight what our priorities are, then the administration's got to negotiate those priorities, and it'll ensure that a lot of our small and medium companies are going to engage in trade opportunities, because as of now, it's been more limited to larger corporations and institutions, that have the compliance and the lawyers and everyone that can deal with big, large, complex trade situations. And the reality is this is going to really open up the door for more opportunity both in Asia and in Europe. And you may not think in Europe that trade's a big deal, because we already have 50% of the world's GDP, 30% of the world's trade moving between the EU and the United States. But the reality is this is more about some of these behind the border measures that are slowing down the movement of goods and services. So it's not tariffs, it's not quotas, it's actually regulations. And it's streamlining regulations and testing certifications and standards, so we're all speaking the same language that'll actually allow that to happen a lot quicker and a lot more efficiently. And the benefit of that is if we can do that and do it correctly, it forces a lot of the bad actors around the world, like China, Brazil, or some of those that don't necessarily have the same standards for rule of law, et cetera. They have no choice but to follow our lead, because the EU and the United States together are such a large component of the economy that we can actually drive very high standards agreements, which is really important, I think, for economic growth down the road. And then I have to just share a little about the opportunity and the disappointment just in terms of where our economy is right now. And there's no doubt that it should be doing better, it's improved, but there's a couple of interesting things that statistics and points to just to make you aware of. And I'm also on the Joint Economic Committee. I serve on there with Senator Klobuchar. It's the only committee that's bicameral, bipartisan, between House and Senate. And it was set up as a counterweight to the President's Council of Economic Advisors many years ago. And so we get together, once a month or every other month, and we look at labor data and statistics and numbers, and you're supposed to essentially look into the data and then make recommendations to the broader Congress about things to do to actually improve the economy, or basically identify trends. And the key trend we've identified is we're in a growth gap. I mean, ever since the recession began back in 2008, when it kind of closed up essentially, and kind of finally halted essentially, we've been in a growth gap. And what does that mean? It essentially means our economy in the United States, we normally double every 20 years. That's been our historical pattern throughout our history. We double every 20 years. But because of a lot of the challenges we've had in the last 6 to 7 years in particular, we've added 10 years onto the growth cycle. So as a result, we'll double in 30 years. So what does that mean? Well, even if we had an average recovery, just a C, right? In Minnesota, we can always do better than a C. We're used to that, right? But if you had an average recovery, just a family of 4 in a 4-year period would have an extra $13,000 in their pocket right now. I mean, that's a lot of money, whether it's spending on higher education or anything else. And, if you look at just median household income actually dropping since the recession happened, or since the recovery actually began, it's the only time in history that median income has dropped during an economic recovery. And so wages are down. And so while we may be more productive and efficient, there's still a lot of nervousness about the economy. It's actually the record amount of time in terms of actually getting back to the starting point of where we were when the recession started. It's the worst economic recovery we've ever had in the history of the country. And there's record numbers of people working part-time that would like to work full-time. And that's a big number. Then the labor participation rate's at its lowest rate since 1978, which is a long period of time. And then you got a third of Americans between age 18 and 31 that are living at home with their parents for a variety of reasons. Some might just be millennials that want to do that, but the reality is part of it is dictated by economic situations as well. And so the question is, how do you turn that around? You know, it might be trade agreements, right, in terms of moving that opportunity forward. But I would also argue that the biggest thing we could do is just, from a Washington perspective, is just give more certainty, give more confidence to small businesses and medium companies, or the business community in general for planning, whether it's tax reform, for instance, or regulatory reform. And just on the tax front, you know, the United States is the only country in the world that lets important parts of its tax code expire every year. So every year we let parts of our tax code expire. It's these little tax extenders, research and development tax credit. It's been around since 1981. We've renewed it 30-some times. You'd think if it made that much of a difference and helped the economy, we'd make it permanent, right? Just to give confidence to anyone who's going to use it that it's going to be around. But we're literally right now in retroactive tax mode right now on all these different provisions. They were enacted the second week of December, and they expired the end of December last year. And so at the end of this year, some are proposing that we just extend them for one more year, which would again make them retroactive, or we do it for 2 years or for 6 months. And that does nothing to give confidence if you're going to invest in capital equipment, if you're going to invest in your employees, just to kind of know what the rules of the game are. And so in the House, we just took a different approach. We just said at the beginning of the year, let's pick a handful of those extenders that are tied to the economy that we do every year, and let's make them permanent. And we did that with research and development. We did that with some expensing for small business. We did it for some of the charitable tax provisions that I am actually carrying, and big bipartisan votes. And we're hoping the Senate will actually bring those up later this fall. The Senate's just kind of a different culture. They're moving slower, and they're probably going to tend to want to just do a renewal of maybe 1 or 2 years on all these extenders. But we're trying to get something, kind of a good negotiation here, and actually get some of these off the table for some permanency down the road. And there is one area I think we could see some opportunity for success later this fall, and it's in the area of this international tax reform discussion. That's really important. Now, you may know more about it in Minnesota because you know the Medtronic inversion that happened. We have our companies inverting and then relocating their headquarters to another country, right, because of lower tax competitiveness and rates that exist in Ireland or other countries. But the bigger issue, and this is the story that's really been untold, but it's going to continue to be a big problem, is that if we don't do anything to address our uncompetitive tax situation, because we're the highest in the world, and we treat our international tax codes so disproportionately unfairly to our folks back home, that you're going to continue to see a lot of acquisitions. Our companies are going to get gobbled up by headquarters from around the world, and then that means eventually we lose the innovation, we lose the jobs, we lose the headquarters that are here. And so there is an opportunity. There's a group of folks in both the House and the Senate that are actually moving forward to do international reform. And just to give you an example of how it works, if right now under the rules with the United States, if you're Harley Davidson, you're selling a motorcycle in Germany, you're going to pay the tax in Germany where the sale is, and then you're going to pay a tax if you bring the earnings back home to the United States, right? So a lot of companies don't bring the earnings back home because they don't want to pay the highest tax in the world, right? So they keep the earnings overseas. It's trapped overseas. $2 trillion of American money is overseas right now. It's not being deployed in capital in the United States. If you're BMW in Germany, you sell a motorcycle in the United States, you pay the tax in the United States, but they bring the money back to Germany tax-free. And we're one of the only countries that does this. So we're handicapping ourselves. We're killing ourselves, actually. And there's an opportunity to make headway on that issue later this fall, hopefully. And then hopefully I think this leads in the broader discussion of just where we need to go with tax reform, because it certainly has not kept pace. The tax code has not kept pace with the modern economy. As I like to say, the size of the tax code is 10 times the size of the Holy Bible without the good news. You know, folks like Dave Sennis and Jack Carlson can navigate the tax code maybe, but a lot of us can't. And just having a more simpler, fair, and flatter tax code will go a long way to actually improving our economy. And I want to leave some time for questions, but I will say this, is that you know, we have a lot of challenges. We'll have a budget, you know, some of the annual budget battles that go on out in Washington. Foreign policy has kind of been right front and center in front of us recently because of the Iran nuclear deal that the president negotiated. I was not a fan of that. And there are other challenges in the Middle East with ISIS, in the Ukrainian situation, and Russia now not even more involved in Ukraine, but actually getting more involved in Syria. They're flying and putting troops on the ground in the Middle East, the first time they've ever done that. in history. So these are things to watch, they're things to pay attention to, and I think they are issues that are going to test both the current Congress and the administration as we go through a turnover phase, right, with the new administration coming in a year, with some real challenging situations. But my model is to always continue to listen and learn. No, I don't have all the answers to a lot of the big challenges that are facing us, but want to make sure that we give a thoughtful approach as much as possible to a lot of these big issues. And then in the end, just like Rotarians, just get some stuff done. So with that, I'll close up and maybe take any questions you might have, but thanks for all you do as Rotarians, and thanks for having me here today.
I have two questions.
Okay.
The first one is, can you give us an example of the last time you actually had fun in your job? And the second question, is, are you looking at higher office, and what would it be?
Okay. Well, first of all, there are plenty of opportunities to have fun, and I do it in this sense. So one of the reasons I think I've been so successful in getting a lot of folks to co-sponsor my legislation is you just get to know people, right? It's about building relationships. So if I've got a bill like repealing the medical device tax, I'll shop that around on the floor. And so we ended up getting 270 co-authors, a real big number, and we passed it with a big vote, essentially, right? Which is really important. And it just feels good knowing you can do that. And that comes through, I think, building relationships. I think one example is playing hockey, right? So once a week I play hockey in DC, and I don't do it just to get a workout, but I actually get to know some of my colleagues, It's no checking, by the way. But it is fun, and if you're out doing things on a social basis with some of your colleagues, you're less likely to say nasty things about them or, rib them about, something you may not agree with them. You're not going to always agree, but you are going to work together on some of your issues you might have some commonality on, which is really important. And I'll be honest, where I'm at right now, being on the Ways and Means Committee, it is a great opportunity to actually do some stuff. And I love it. And being in the majority on the Ways and Means Committee, it might be human trafficking, it might be tax reform, and it might be trade. I mean, this is a committee, as Bill Frenzel was on this committee, as Jim Ramstad was on this committee. It's not about being on some powerful committee. It's about making a difference in Minnesota's economy. So as long as I feel like I'm being impactful, I'm just going to be content to just keep working as hard as I can where I'm at right now. And it feels good to be able to do that. Yeah.
This is somewhat of a selfish question and have a planning practice. So you mentioned one of the tax reforms. Can you have any update on the qualified charitable distribution component?
Yeah, so, and this is one of those issues that's come up, periodically. And in fact, now I think I'm actually carrying the bill to actually make this a permanent provision so you can, use your IRA, et cetera, for charitable, right? That's a component. And you can plan on it, as the year progresses, rather than waiting till the end of the year to find out if it's going to be there. It's another example of the tax code and the uncertainty that's been out there. I'll just say it's definitely in the higher tier of issues that are there for renewal or for passing. That's the good news. The bad news is I don't know if it's going to be for more than a one-time thing again, right? And so that's the challenge we're in right now.
So Eric, you will be here for additional questions?
Yep, I'm going to hang around.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, thanks for having me.
Eric, in appreciation for your speaking presentation today, a donation to End Polio will be made in your name to End Polio Now, which is the signature project of Rotary International. In the early 1980s, there were 400,000 of cases of polio each year, and Rotary decided to join with other organizations to lead the eradication of polio in the world. We are so close to eradicating this devastating disease. In 2015, we've had 33 cases limited to 2 countries. Success over polio will help fuel the energy for what people of the world can do when we work together. And so with that, right underneath your glass is your certificate of, to indicate that you spoke today and that a donation will be made in your name. And here is an End Polio Now rodeo.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
All right.